The violin they sold was actually still mine. My grandfather's voice was steady, not loud, not sharp, just firm enough to stop the room cold. My father froze with one hand on the back of the chair. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. The color drained from my father's face so quickly it startled me. My brother standing near the doorway looked like he'd been caught somewhere he never meant to be. No one spoke. The words hung there heavy and undeniable. Still mine. That was the moment everything changed. But the sale had already happened. A week earlier, none of us were standing in that living room. None of us knew what was coming. I was sitting in a hospital waiting area, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. St. Luke's Medical Center had a way of making time feel slower than it already was. My grandfather was inside getting tests done. At 86, every appointment came with an unspoken tension. He didn't complain. He never had. He just handed over his insurance card, joked with the nurses, and followed instructions like he always had, quietly, precisely. While he was inside, I stepped outside to take a call. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor. "Did you authorize your parents to sell the violin?" I stared at the screen, certain there had been a mistake. "What violin?" I typed back. The reply came almost immediately. "The old one. A man came with a padded case. They said it was sold." I felt my chest tighten. "The violin." The antique one my grandfather had given me years earlier. The one he'd carried through military moves and long nights when sleep wouldn't come easily. The one he'd placed in my hands one afternoon and said, "This has been with me longer than most people. Take care of it." I called my father. No answer. I called my mother. Straight to voicemail. When my grandfather came back out, he looked tired but relaxed, like the appointment had gone as expected. He smiled when he saw me. "All done," he said. "You ready to head home?" I nodded, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Yeah, let's go." On the drive back, the radio played softly. A local station, old songs, familiar voices. My grandfather watched the road pass by through the windshield, quiet as ever. "You're tense," he said at last. "Just thinking," I replied. That was true. I just wasn't ready to say about what. My parents' house looked exactly the same when we pulled in. White siding, clean porch, the American flag hanging just slightly crooked the way my father liked it. Nothing about it suggested something important had already been taken from inside. They were waiting in the living room. My father stood when we entered. My mother remained seated, hands folded too neatly in her lap. My brother wasn't there yet. That absence said more than anything else. I didn't sit down. "Where's the violin?" I asked. My father exhaled slowly, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. "We sold it." The words landed flat, final. "You sold what I asked." "The violin," my mother said gently. "We needed to." My grandfather lowered himself into his chair carefully. He didn't speak. "How much?" I asked. My father hesitated, then he said it. $126,800. The number echoed in my head. $126,800. And why I said, keeping my voice level, "Did you need that much money?" My mother looked down. My father answered. "Your brother's in serious trouble. This was the fastest way to help." Of course it was. My brother had always needed help. Failed ventures, unpaid loans, bad decisions followed by promises he never kept. And every time my parents stepped in. Quietly, consistently. At someone else's expense. Usually mine. "You didn't ask me," I said. "It was in our house," my father replied. "It wasn't yours," I said. My mother shook her head. "It was a gift. To you. From him." She nodded toward my grandfather. "That makes it family property." My grandfather looked up then. "They sold the violin?" he asked. "Yes, Dad," my father said. "It was just sitting there." My grandfather studied him for a long moment. "How much did they pay?" he asked. $126,800, I said before my father could repeat it. My grandfather nodded slowly. No anger crossed his face, no shock, just quiet acknowledgement. "That explains it," he said. "Explains what?" my father asked. Grandpa didn't answer him. He looked at me instead. "Did they tell you who bought it?" I shook my head. He nodded once more. That violin, he said calmly, has paperwork most people don't bother to read. My father laughed nervously. Dad, it's just an instrument. My grandfather met his eyes. No, he said softly, it isn't. He leaned back and folded his hands. The violin they sold was actually... He stopped. Not because he forgot. Because he wanted them to sit with it. We'll talk about it later, he said, rising slowly. I'm tired. As he walked down the hallway, my father stood, frozen confusion beginning to replace confidence. I didn't follow. I already knew one thing for certain. This wasn't finished. It had only just begun. By the next morning, the house felt different. Nothing had been moved, yet everything felt disturbed, like furniture shifted a few inches out of place. My parents avoided the living room. My father stayed in the garage longer than usual, pretending to organize tools that had been in the same drawer for years. My mother busied herself with laundry that didn't need doing. My grandfather sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, reading the local paper as if nothing had happened. That was what unsettled me most. He wasn't confused, he wasn't shaken, he was patient. When I finally sat across from him, he folded the newspaper, carefully squared the edges, and looked at me with the same steady eyes he'd always had. You want to know why I'm not angry? He said. I nodded. I've learned, he said, that anger only helps the person who deserves it the least. He took another sip of coffee, then set the mug down. That violin, he continued, was never just a violin. I knew that already, but hearing it from him carried weight. He told me about the first time he saw it. He was 22, newly enlisted, stationed far from home. Money was tight. Letters came late. Nights were long. One evening, while wandering past a pawn shop near the base, he noticed the violin in the window. Old, well-kept, not flashy. Something about it felt familiar even before he touched it. The owner told him it had belonged to a European immigrant who'd played it at community halls and small churches across the Midwest. No fame, no recordings. Just decades of quiet music passed from hand to hand. It wasn't expensive back then, Grandpa said, but it mattered. He bought it with part of his first real paycheck. That violin followed him everywhere, from base to base, from one rented room to the next. He played it softly at night, never to perform, never to impress, just to remember who he was when everything else felt like it belonged to the military. When you spend your life taking orders, he said, you learn to hold on to the few things that are truly yours. Over the years, the violin gained more than scratches and wear. It gained documentation, service records, provenance tied to military archives, a quiet acknowledgement of how art and service often overlapped in ways most people never noticed. My father never paid attention to any of that. He saw the violin as an object, something valuable, something idle. You know, Grandpa said your father always thought responsibility meant control. I didn't argue. When I gave you the violin, he said it wasn't because I was done with it. It was because I trusted you. I remembered that day clearly. He hadn't wrapped it. He hadn't made a speech. He'd simply opened the case and slid it across the table. You don't rush things, he'd said. That matters. I swallowed hard. Across the house, the sound of the garage door closing echoed. My father had come inside. He hovered in the doorway, listening, pretending not to. Grandpa noticed, of course. There's something else, he said, raising his voice just enough. My father stepped closer. The violin wasn't mine to sell, Grandpa said evenly, and it wasn't yours either. My father frowned. Dad, I raised her. It was in my house. That doesn't make it yours, Grandpa replied. He turned to me again. When I gave you that violin, he said it was a conditional gift. My heart skipped. There were terms, he continued, written ones. My father stiffened. What terms? Grandpa didn't answer him directly. The violin was registered under my name, he said, and under my service record. I allowed it to be kept with you, played by you, cared for by you. He paused. But ownership, he shook his head. That stayed with me. The room went quiet. You didn't think that mattered, Grandpa said, looking at my father. Because you've always believed family overrides paperwork. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. And your brother Grandpa went on has been living on that belief for years. That struck deeper. My brother had arrived sometime during that conversation. He stood near the hallway, arms crossed, eyes tired. For the first time, he looked uncertain. You always bailed him out, Grandpa said calmly. You taught him that consequences were optional. My mother finally spoke. We were trying to help. I know, Grandpa said, but help that costs someone else their dignity isn't help. No one argued. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. This is Heritage String and Archive, the voice said. We handled the sale of the violin. My father straightened instantly. There's been a complication, the man continued. We need to speak with the rightful owner. I glanced at Grandpa. He nodded once. Put it on speaker, he said. My father's face drained of color. The voice on the other end continued professional and calm. The documentation attached to this instrument indicates restricted transfer. We're reviewing the conditions. My father sat down heavily. We'll be in touch, the man concluded, soon. When the call ended, no one spoke. My grandfather broke the silence. I told you, he said gently, it wasn't just a violin. My father finally looked at him, fear replacing certainty. What happens now, he asked. Grandpa folded his hands. Now, he said, we let the truth do what it's supposed to do. And for the first time I saw something shift. Not anger, not revenge. Just the quiet beginning of accountability. By the time evening settled in, the truth had begun to take shape, but not the way my parents expected. The phone call from the auction house had changed the air in the house. It wasn't dramatic, there were no raised voices. Just a slow, creeping realization that something they thought was settled was in fact very much alive. My brother stayed. That alone was unusual. Normally, once money changed hands, he disappeared. Problems solved meant obligations avoided, but this time he lingered in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching, as if staying close might somehow protect him. It wouldn't. My father paced, back and forth, back and forth. The man who prided himself on decisiveness now couldn't decide where to sit. My mother folded and unfolded a dish towel that never made it to the kitchen. And my brother, my older brother, the reason for all of this, finally spoke. I didn't ask for this, he said. The words landed wrong. No, I replied quietly, you just accepted it. He scoffed. You don't know what I'm dealing with. I looked at him then, really looked. He was 62 years old, older than me, old enough to know better, old enough to have learned something from the decades of chances he'd been given. I know exactly what you're dealing with, I said. I've been watching it for 40 years. My father snapped. That's enough. No, Grandpa said calmly from his chair. It isn't. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. My brother turned toward him. Dad, I'm trying to get back on my feet. Grandpa nodded. You've been trying since 1987. The silence that followed was heavy. My brother's debt wasn't new. It hadn't come from one bad break or one unlucky turn. It was a pattern, a slow erosion of responsibility disguised as effort, failed businesses, loans taken out in other people's names, promises made and quietly forgotten. My parents never spoke about it openly. They called it helping. They called it family. Grandpa called it what it was. Every time you fall, he said to my brother, someone cushions the ground for you. You never learn how hard it really is. My father rubbed his temples. What was I supposed to do? Let him drown? You were supposed to let him swim, Grandpa replied. That night, after everyone went to bed, I found my father sitting alone at the dining table, paperwork spread out in front of him. Receipts, bank statements, a copy of the sale agreement from the auction house. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. They said it was clean, he muttered, not looking up. The sale. They said everything checked out. Did you read the provenance documents, I asked. He didn't answer. You never read those, I continued. You never cared where things came from, only what they were worth. That stung, he flinched. The buyer paid in full, he said. That money's already gone. I knew where it had gone. Toward my brother's debts. Old ones, new ones. A temporary fix that would unravel the moment another bill arrived. The next morning, the auction house called again. This time, they asked for me by name. There are additional records tied to the instrument, the representative explained. Military archives. Registration under a service-related collection. My father listened from the doorway, his face tightening with every sentence. We need to verify ownership, the voice continued. Until that's resolved, the sale is under review. What does that mean? My father asked sharply. It means the man replied evenly that funds may need to be returned. My father sank into a chair. My brother stood up. Returned, I already used that money. No one responded. The man on the phone continued, we'll be reaching out to the original registrant. He meant Grandpa. After the call ended, my brother rounded on my father. You said this was done, he snapped. My father didn't look at him. I thought it was. You thought my brother barked. You sold something that wasn't yours. The irony wasn't lost on me. Grandpa watched them quietly as if observing a lesson long overdue. This is what happens, he said at last, when you solve the wrong problem. My brother turned away, running a hand through his thinning hair. For the first time I saw fear there. Real fear. Not of debt, but of standing alone with it. Later that afternoon, Grandpa asked me to help him retrieve a lockbox from the closet in his old room. The same room he'd stayed in whenever his health took a dip. The same room my father had never bothered to clean out. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, dates, serial numbers, letters from bases long closed, documentation my father had never known existed. Grandpa handed me one folder. Bring this when they call again, he said. They will. I believed him. That evening my brother packed a small bag. I'll figure something out, he muttered. I didn't stop him. My parents watched him leave with the same mixture of guilt and relief they always had. But this time there was something else underneath. Uncertainty. For the first time in decades, no one was rushing in to save him. And for the first time, my father began to understand something he should have learned long ago. Selling the violin hadn't solved a problem. It had exposed one. The call came 3 days later. It was early afternoon, the kind of quiet hour when the house seemed to hold its breath. My parents were both home pretending to go about their routines. My father sat at the kitchen table sorting through papers he'd already sorted twice. My mother wiped down counters that were already clean. No one spoke about what we were waiting for, but we all knew. My grandfather was in his room resting. When my phone rang, I knew before I looked at the screen. I answered and put it on speaker. This is Heritage String and Archive, the voice said, calm and measured. We're calling to follow up regarding the violin sold last week. My father stood up immediately. We've reviewed the documentation, the representative continued. There are ownership concerns that need to be addressed directly with the original registrant. My father's jaw tightened. I'm the one who handled the sale. Yes, sir, the man replied. That's part of the issue. I went to my grandfather's room and gently knocked. He was awake, sitting upright, hands folded neatly in his lap as if he'd been expecting this. They're calling, I said. He nodded, put it through. We gathered in the living room. My parents sat on opposite ends of the couch. I stood near the doorway. Grandpa took his chair steady and composed. I held the phone out. Sir, the representative said, his tone respectful. We've identified you as the registered owner of the instrument. That's correct, Grandpa said. There are conditions attached to the violin's transfer, the man continued. We'd like you to confirm whether those conditions were met. They were not, Grandpa replied. My father leaned forward. Dad, come on. Grandpa raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. When I acquired that violin, he said calmly, I registered it under a military archive program for personal artifacts retained during service. It was later documented as a conditional gift. Usage rights were granted. Ownership was not. The line went quiet for a moment. That aligns with our findings, the representative said. In that case, the sale was unauthorized. My father's face drained of color. What does that mean, he asked. It means, the man replied, the buyer is entitled to a refund, and the instrument must be returned to its rightful owner. My brother wasn't there to hear it. Part of me was relieved. The funds, my father said hoarsely, they've already been spent. I understand, the representative said, but resolution will still be required. The call ended shortly after. No one moved. My mother was the first to speak. Why didn't you tell us, she asked Grandpa, her voice small. He looked at her kindly. You didn't ask. My father stared at the floor. I thought family meant... Family means trust, Grandpa said, not entitlement. That evening he asked me to sit with him. There's something I should tell you, he said. I listened as he explained the rest. How the violin had been tied not only to his service, but to a small foundation he'd helped establish years ago, one that supported veterans who turned to music as a form of rehabilitation. The violin had been listed as part of that legacy, with specific language ensuring it would never be sold without consent. "I didn't do it to trap anyone," he said. "I did it to protect what mattered." The next morning my brother called. "They want the money back," he said flatly. "Yes," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "I don't have it," he said. "I know." For once there was nothing else to say. That afternoon my father finally broke. "I thought I was helping," he said to Grandpa, voice cracking. "I thought I was fixing things." "You were avoiding them," Grandpa replied gently. "There's a difference." The auction house called again later that week. Arrangements were made, timelines established, consequences outlined. And through it all, Grandpa remained calm. When I asked him how he could be so steady, he smiled faintly. "I learned a long time ago," he said, "that the truth doesn't need force. It only needs time." As the days passed, my father's certainty unraveled into something quieter: regret, reflection, the realization that decades of enabling had finally reached a wall. The violin was coming home, but not to the place it had been taken from. And the debt my brother had avoided for so long was no longer someone else's burden to carry. The buyer arrived the following Tuesday. Not in person at first, but through a thick envelope delivered by certified mail. My father stood at the front door holding it, staring at the return address as if it might change if he looked long enough. Heritage String and Archive. Inside were documents, clear, precise, unemotional, the kind of paperwork that doesn't accuse, doesn't argue, and doesn't bend. The letter stated in plain language that the buyer had initiated a formal review. The fund's $126,800 were to be returned within 30 days. Failure to comply would trigger legal recovery. My father sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "They're serious," he said. "They always are," Grandpa replied from the living room. That afternoon the phone rang again. This time the buyer himself was on the line. Not angry, not smug, just professional. "I wanted to speak directly," the man said, "out of courtesy." He explained that he was a collector, but not the kind my father had imagined. He didn't flip instruments, he preserved them. His garage wasn't full of dust and oil stains, but climate-controlled cases and catalog numbers. He'd recognized the violin immediately, not just its craftsmanship, but its markings. "There are only a few like it," he said, "and fewer with documented military provenance." My father listened in silence. "I assumed the seller understood what he had," the man continued. "It's clear now that wasn't the case." "What happens next?" my father asked. "That depends," the buyer replied, "on whether you want to make this right quickly or expensively." The line went quiet. Later that evening my brother showed up. He looked tired, older than he had a week earlier. The confidence he usually carried like armor was gone. "They're asking for the money back," he said, as if announcing bad weather. "Yes," my father replied. "I don't have it," my brother said again. No one responded. For the first time in years, no one rushed to fill the silence for him. "I thought it was done," my brother muttered. "I thought you handled it." My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I handled it wrong," he said. That admission alone would have been unthinkable a month earlier. My brother looked at Grandpa. "You could help," he said quietly. "You could say it's fine." Grandpa shook his head. "I could," he said, "but I won't." The buyer called one last time before the week was out. "The violin will be returned to its registered owner," he said. "That part is settled." My father swallowed. "And the money?" "That's yours to resolve," the man replied. When the call ended, my father put his head in his hands. For decades, he'd believed that solving problems meant removing consequences. Now, for the first time, the consequences had arrived anyway. The violin came back 2 days later. I was the one who signed for it. The case felt heavier than I remembered, not physically, but emotionally. When I opened it, the familiar scent of old wood and polish filled the room. Nothing about it had changed. Except us. Grandpa asked me to place it on the table. He ran his fingers gently along the edge of the case, then closed it again. "This is where it belongs," he said. My father watched, eyes rimmed red. "I'm sorry," he said at last. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just honestly. Grandpa nodded. "Then start acting like it," he replied. "The money didn't come back all at once. That was the part my father hadn't expected. He had imagined a single problem, a single solution, some way to smooth things over quietly like he always had before. But reality arrived in pieces. Deadlines, letters, phone calls that came during dinner. Notices that didn't care about intentions, only outcomes. The $126,800 was gone, every dollar of it. My brother admitted that much within a day of the violin's return. Not with shame exactly, but with a kind of resignation, as if this was simply how things always ended up. I used it to close accounts, he said, pay off people who wouldn't wait anymore. And now, my father asked. My brother shrugged. Now they're waiting again. That night my father didn't sleep. I know because neither did I. I could hear him moving around the house, opening drawers, closing them, sitting down, standing back up. At some point near dawn, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing things down. Numbers, names, dates. For the first time, he wasn't trying to rescue anyone. He was trying to understand. The next week unfolded slowly, painfully. My brother met with a financial counselor for the first time in his life. Not one arranged by my parents, but one he had to sit across from alone. My parents spoke to an attorney not to fight the auction house, but to make sure they didn't make the situation worse. Grandpa stayed out of it. That wasn't indifference, it was discipline. You don't learn by having someone else speak for you, he said when my mother asked him to intervene. You learn by standing in the silence yourself. One afternoon, my father asked Grandpa to sit with him. Just the two of them. I stayed in the other room, not eavesdropping, but close enough to hear the cadence of their voices. My father's was lower than usual. Careful, Grandpa's steady as ever. I thought I was protecting the family, my father said. You were protecting a habit, Grandpa replied. There was a long pause. I didn't mean to hurt her, my father said. Or you. I know, Grandpa said, but intention doesn't undo damage. That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else that had been said all week. When my father finally came out, his eyes were red, but his shoulders looked lighter, as if something he'd been carrying for decades had finally been set down, not gently, but honestly. The next call came from the auction house. They confirmed the matter was closed on their end. The violin was returned. The buyer had been refunded. No further action would be taken, provided repayment plans were honored. My father thanked them. When he hung up, he turned to me. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. I treated what belonged to you as if it belonged to me, he continued, and I treated your brother's failures as if they were mine to erase. He swallowed. That wasn't fair, to either of you. I nodded, not because everything was fixed, but because something real had finally been said. Later that evening, my brother stopped by again. He looked different, not transformed, just quieter. I'm not asking for help, he said to me. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't complete. But it was his. I don't expect forgiveness, he added. I just don't want to pretend anymore. That mattered more than he probably realized. The paperwork from Grandpa's lockbox was filed away properly the next day. Copies sent, originals secured, not to hide them but to honor them. The violin's status was clarified, its legacy protected. That afternoon, Grandpa asked me to bring the violin to his room. He didn't ask me to play. He just wanted it there. I'm not keeping it, he said. I just wanted to see it again. I placed the case beside his chair. He rested his hand on it for a moment, then looked up at me. You handled this well, he said. I didn't feel like I did, I admitted. He smiled faintly. That's usually how it feels when you do. Before dinner, my father came into the room. Dad, he said, standing awkwardly, there's something I need to ask. Grandpa waited. When you said the violin was still yours, my father continued, why didn't you just say it outright? Why wait? Grandpa considered that. Because he said you needed to hear it when you were ready to listen, not when I was ready to speak. My father nodded slowly. That night, for the first time in a long while, we all sat at the same table. No shouting, no accusations, just the quiet presence of consequences finally acknowledged. Nothing was magically repaired. But something essential had been restored. Respect. The house grew quieter after that. Not empty, just calmer. The kind of calm that comes after a long argument finally ends, not because someone won, but because the truth has been spoken and there's nothing left to pretend about. My brother moved out within the month, not in anger, not in shame either. He found a small apartment across town and for the first time I could remember paid the deposit himself. It wasn't a fresh start in the dramatic sense. It was modest, unremarkable, and that in a way made it honest. My parents adjusted slowly. My mother stopped rushing to fix things before they broke. She listened more, she asked questions she'd avoided for years. My father became quieter, not withdrawn, but thoughtful. He no longer spoke as if responsibility meant control. He spoke as if it meant restraint. One afternoon he came to me with the violin case in his hands. "I'd like you to keep this somewhere safe," he said, "not here." I understood what he meant. I took it to my own home and placed it in a room with sunlight away from traffic and noise. I didn't play it right away. I just let it be there, whole, undisturbed. Grandpa's health stabilized for a while. We knew it wouldn't last forever. None of us said it out loud, but we felt it in the careful way time passed, in the way conversations lingered, in the way silence became less uncomfortable. One evening as the sun dipped low and the house filled with long shadows, Grandpa asked me to sit with him. "You know," he said, "people think legacy is about what you leave behind." I waited. "It isn't," he continued. "It's about what you refuse to let be misused." That stayed with me. He never asked for the violin again. He didn't need to. It had done what it was meant to do, not musically, but morally. A few weeks later, my father sat beside him holding his hand. No arguments, no defenses, just presence. "I should have listened sooner," my father said quietly. Grandpa smiled. "You listened when it mattered." That was as close to forgiveness as he ever came in words, and it was enough. After Grandpa passed, there was no chaos, no scrambling, no surprises. Everything was already settled. Not because he'd hidden things, but because he'd made them clear. At the small service we held, people spoke about his discipline, his service, his calm. No one mentioned the violin. They didn't need to. The lesson it carried had already been passed on. Months later, I finally opened the case and played. Not for long, just enough to hear the sound fill the room. It was warm, steady, unrushed. I understood then why Grandpa had held on to it all those years. It wasn't about music. It was about patience, about ownership, about knowing when to act and when to let consequences speak for themselves. My family didn't become perfect after that. Families rarely do. But we became honest. And sometimes that's the greater miracle. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one expected to sacrifice quietly or watched responsibility mistaken for entitlement, I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect. Consider what in your own life deserves protection. Consider where boundaries might be an act of love, not distance. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about legacy, accountability, and quiet strength, feel free to share this one with someone who might need it. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories grounded in real life, real families, and real consequences, I invite you to subscribe and stay a while.